Factor out the greatest common factor, or the GCF. In this example, we see that we have 2 times parentheses x minus 5 plus 3x times parentheses x minus 5. Now in this case, our GCF is a binomial. The GCF in this case would be that x minus 5. So when you're factoring out the GCF, you want to first write the GCF and then an open parentheses. So in this case, our GCF is that parentheses x minus 5 parentheses. Then I have my open parentheses, and what needs to go into the other parentheses is what's left after I divide out the GCF. So when I divide the GCF out of the first term, I end up getting 2, and out of the second term, I get plus 3x. So this is what I get when I factor out the GCF, and the GCF is a binomial. Pause and try. So again, our GCF is a binomial, y plus 4 parentheses x squared plus 6. Now, when we're factored by grouping, you need to have 4 terms. So factoring by grouping, when you have 4 terms, the process that you take is you're going to use grouping symbols. Now, grouping symbols in mathematics is parentheses. So when we want to factor by grouping, we're going to group. And how it works is you're going to group using parentheses the first 2 terms together, and then group the last 2 terms together. Now notice that that sign in the middle needs to stay outside of the second grouping symbols. That's very important that you group the first 2, leave the middle sign out, and group the last 2. Then the next step is to factor out the greatest common factor out of the first grouping and the greatest common factor out of the second grouping. So when I look at the first grouping, my greatest common factor is going to be 3x squared. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to factor it out of each term. And remember, when you factor it out, you're dividing each term by the GCF. Whatever's left goes inside the parentheses. So when I take it out of the 6x to the third, I'm left with 2x. When I take it out of the 9x squared, I'm left with minus 3x. And I close the parentheses. And now that middle sign needs to come down, and then I'm going to find the GCF of the 4x minus 6. The GCF of 4x minus 6 is going to be the 2, and then I'm going to divide it out of each term, and whatever's left will go inside the parentheses. So I'm left with 2x minus 3. Now notice here, I have that common binomial. Because I have a common binomial of 2x minus 3, I can factor that out as a GCF. So now I factor out that common binomial, that 2x minus 3, and then whatever is left, I factor and put it inside the second parentheses. So when I divide 2x squared times 2x minus 3, I divide the 2x minus 3 out, I'm left with 3x squared plus 2x. So now I have this factored by grouping into 2 factored binomials. Pause and try. So again, grouping the first 2 terms, leaving that middle sign out, and grouping the second 2 terms. Factoring out the GCF of the first 2 terms, and what's left is going to be that 4x plus 1. Bringing down that middle sign, factoring out the GCF of the last 2 terms, and I'm left with the 4x plus 1. I have a GCF of a binomial 4x plus 1. I'm going to factor that out, and what's left is going to be the 2x squared plus 3. Now when you're factoring by grouping, So I'm going to do the factoring by grouping, and I want you to notice here when I group the first two terms together and I group the last two terms together, what's on the outside or what's in the middle, that middle sign, is a minus. Well, whenever that middle sign is a minus, you have to change that last sign. So whatever the last sign is, in this case it's plus 9, when I do the grouping, I have that minus on the outside, I have to change that plus to a minus. So when you're factoring by grouping, and your middle sign is a minus or a negative, you need to switch the sign of your last term to whatever the opposite sign is. So in this case, the opposite sign of a plus is a minus. And now we're going to follow the same steps. You're going to factor out the GCF of the first two terms, and then you're going to factor out the GCF of the last two terms. But don't forget to bring down that middle sign. It's very important that that middle sign comes down. I'm factoring out the GCF of the last two terms, and now you see we have that common binomial. So you have to be very careful. If you would have forgot to change that last term sign, we would have had a plus inside that last binomial, and we wouldn't have had the same binomials. Now, because they're the same, I can factor that out, and whatever's left would go into the other binomial. So now this is factored by grouping, and when that middle sign is a minus. Pause and try. So again, grouping, you see that that middle sign's a minus. I have to change the end sign to its opposite. I'm factoring out the GCF of the first two terms, bringing down that minus, factoring out the GCF of the second two terms, and you see here the GCF of x minus 3 is 1. And I need to have that value there because when I factor out that common binomial, I need to make sure that I have that number in the second binomial. So I end up getting this x minus 3 times 4x squared minus 1.